Let's move on over to the China segment. And this segment is called Ships and Chips. Why don't we start with the ships? Tiffany, what's up with the Chinese ships?
It sure is called Ships and Chips. So this week in the news, as I'm sure people have seen on social media, there's been, increasing aggression from China around the Philippines. So this was basically a routine aggression that you see from the Chinese Coast Guard going after the Philippine Coast Guard. This is around the Scarborough Shoal, which the Philippines is like, this is ours. And China claims all of the South China Sea. So they're always in there trying to dispute this and make it a dispute. So you have this where, the Philippines Coast Guard is like trying to evade this Chinese Coast Guard. And then what happens when in this high-speed chase is that the Chinese ship rams into its own Chinese Navy ship in the chase. And it actually got pretty hit. Like if you see the videos, it's like pretty crumpled, the front end of the ship. And there's different reports. It was actually, I think some might have died on that ship. It was not a good clash, the Chinese side. And then the next day in the sky, so this is in the seas, right? So the next day in the skies, you had these Chinese fighter jets doing intercept maneuvers against the Philippine planes. But the Philippines were smart. So they actually had a Reuters reporter on board that filmed everything. So that was happening in the skies. And then
they're using a journalist basically as like a shield. They're just like, here's our journalist.
Yeah, they strap him to the wing.
No, because what China always does, literally if you see this news on social media, the Global Times posted about the ships colliding, but their version is that the Chinese side was heroically chasing away, the Philippines and the US, we'll get to that in a minute, from their waters. So they always do that. So they'll always turn around and say that the Philippines are telling lies. So if you have a reporter there, you're like, this is a third party that's witnessing these, transgressions and aggressions.
That's smart. That's smart to have a journalist on there.
So
unless the plane is shot down.
Well, then we would basically be in war. Because there's a mutual defense treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines. So what happens was right after then, on Wednesday, a U.S. Navy-guided destroyer was doing, the USS Higgins, was performing a freedom of navigation operation near the Scarborough Shoal. And also close by was another one called the USS Cincinnati. So China, of course, turns around and says that these missions by the U.S. threaten its sovereignty and peace and unity in the region. But the U.S. is like, no, we're performing freedom of navigation operations. But this is significant because this is the first time the U.S. has done freedom of operation navigations near the Scarborough Shoal in 6 years.
Wow. Tiffany, I didn't realize that. I was watching those videos kind of like as a third party observer, like, oh, that's fun. Look at those two countries, having fun with each other. Oops, the ships collided. I didn't realize we had a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and if something goes wrong between those two ships, we're in it.
Yeah. So Articles 5 specifically of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Philippines says that we have to defend each other in the event of a quote armed attack on either of the parties. That is deemed to include an armed attack on the metropolitan territory of either of the parties or on the island territories. So that's why it's a lot of the things, I've spoken to a couple different, Navy captains, people in this, the naval specifically expertise areas about, why hasn't it been triggered? Mostly because no one wants that to be triggered. But a lot of the things the Chinese side has been doing would count as transgressions in that, would basically be triggering that. But obviously no one wants, another war. So you have this whole complicated history, though. So why it matters, of course, we have this mutual defense treaty, but also the Philippines was super important during World War II strategically, location-wise. So if we are talking about a potential war, between China and Taiwan, and we have to get involved, we need the Philippines in that area. We have troops there. We have bases there. But why the Scarborough Shoal is always in the news is there's a whole incident back in 2012 where both sides had a 2-month-long standoff. So this is between the Chinese and the Philippines. And eventually it was basically supposed to be mediated where they agreed to withdraw their ships, right? So the Philippines, in good faith, withdraws their own ships. And China's like, nah, they sent another one in instead. And they're like, no, this is ours to begin with. We own all of the South China Sea. And then a lot of the other areas, like Taiwan has claims, Vietnam has claims, obviously the Philippines. So a lot of these areas, most of these countries have claims. And China's like, no, all of it is ours. And then, of course, they have the 9-dash line that you see in maps, especially in Hollywood, animated films as another soft power projection. But anyway, so you have this whole Scarborough Shoal incident. And so it was escalating to the point that eventually the Philippines was appealing to the international tribunals, being like, hey, what the heck? And so in 2016, there was a ruling that came out, and it basically was saying that China's claims to all of the South China Sea is invalid. And China's response, their protest to it was the ruling was, quote, nothing but a scrap of paper. So they dismiss it. So they're still doing all of these skirmishes in the area. So that's why what happens there actually does matter to us, and why, if we do send these ships to that area as basically a presence and a message of deterrence is very important. You also see that in terms of sailing through the Taiwan Strait, right? Germany sent one recently. That was a huge deal because they'd never really done that. So all of those moves, it is under the freedom of navigation operations, but just by sending something there and showing up, it is also sending that message of deterrence. So,
wow. Okay, so
a little history lesson right there.
I appreciated that significantly, and to be honest, that quote that is just a piece of paper.
Scrap paper, not even paper.
I dignify that paper without that modifier. But there is truth to that, and that's why I'm worried about this mutual defense situation, because that's probably why they're pushing it constantly, right? They're because otherwise it's just a waste of gas, right? Otherwise you're just ships take a lot of gas, as do fighter jets. Why you're doing that? So obviously they're out there kind of marking their zone, out there doing their thing. And it would be such a shame to have to do anything to prove that it's not a scrap.
The problem they have is if they pull back, the CCP is just going to take it.
Of course, yeah.
The moment they stop that, the CCP is going to say, we own this now. Because, for example, they've been building fake islands and stuff, artificial islands.
Oh, okay, so those were the ships. Now let's move on over to the chips. And something it is unprecedented, right? This 15% cut that the U.S. is getting. Can you explain?
Yes,
can you explain that situation?
Basically, while the news of the ships colliding were making headlines, there was also a huge announcement, basically the same day from the White House. It was also Monday, right? That was NVIDIA and AMD are the biggest chip makers, and they've been selling to China, but lower end chips. And they're we want to, so microchips, computer chips, and chips, you shorten it to chips. Not the potato chips we're talking about, tiny little microchips, right? And so basically, they've been selling lower end ones to the China market because the most advanced ones, even the ones that NVIDIA, blah, 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 uses, come from TSMC, which is a Taiwanese company. It's in Taiwan. We have a few fabs, the factories, they're called fabs, that we're trying to build in Arizona and stuff, but to scale that up inside the US would take years. So the majority, 90% of the high-end chips that are needed for everything that you see in Intel and NVIDIA, Microsoft, blah, 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 are all made by TSMC, so Taiwan. So China's technology is miles behind when it comes to chips. They have to buy it from other countries, including Samsung chips. It's not as advanced. But what China is good at doing is reverse engineering. So part of why we haven't been selling more advanced chips to China is we don't want them to reverse engineer. So the big news on Monday was that NVIDIA and AMD could sell certain chips, slightly higher end chips, not the highest end, they're known as the Blackwell, but they can sell the H20 and another one, an AMD chip, M1 300 to China. So basically these are purposely slowed slightly compared to what they're normally able to do, the processing power and stuff. And that's why they can enter the China market. But the unprecedented part that you pointed out is that normally you can't sell these to China, these companies. But the deal that the White House announced was that they can sell these lower-end, high-end chips to China, but the White House or the U.S. government would be getting 15% of that revenue. So that's
Bro. At some point, I forgot when, maybe a decade ago, I was reading a book, and it basically compared, not the U.S. government in particular, but government as a whole is basically the biggest mafia in the land, right? It's the one that has the monopoly on power. Such a mafia move, right? To it's give us 15%. We'll take a quick cut of that.
Well, so in reaction and in response, you do have national security hawks on one end being hold up, China has dual civil military fusion. They're going to reverse engineer. This is going to fuel China's AI development.
Sorry, can I just ask you a follow-up question before we continue? So NVIDIA and AMD can now sell these not the highest end chips, right? They're still they have basically a governor on them, right? So they're not the highest chips, but I guess they are the highest chips, but they have like a governor on them to make them less high end than the best
No,
chips?
it'd be like if you're talking about like computer models, it's like maybe like a software would be like 12.5 is the most advanced. It would be like 12.2.
I see. Okay.
So it's like it's still up there, but it's not breaking edge, top of the line.
Okay, and it's those not breaking edge top of the line, but close to its chips that are being sold.
Yes.
And those are the chips that are the 15% cut goes to the U.S. So that's 15% of profits.
Yes.
Wow.
All revenue. And so earlier this year, NVIDIA had already been saying it was on track to sell more than $8 billion worth of these H20 chips in a single quarter to China. And then the Trump administration was like, excuse me, you need an export license if you want to send these to China. And so part of the other end, it's like one is, national security, but the other angle is whether or not this is even constitutional to be able to do that, because, as we well know from the Constitution, if you want to dig into it, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5 says no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. So many are like, hold up, is this the start of a slippery slope? Like, if you're saying these can be exported if you give us a certain, to your mafia point, right? It's like,
this is,
I have a question.
This is like selling guns to an army waging war against you and then asking for a kickback on the profits from the guns you're selling to the army fighting you.
I think we've done that before in the past. But, I think that's happened. But I have a question. So this was basically a deal for China, right? Because this opened up getting more of the rare earth mineral exports from CCP, is that correct? Like this is
yeah. So a couple weeks ago now, I think if you remember, right, like obviously the trade talks are still ongoing, hence the 90-day tariff truce again. But a couple weeks ago, part of the announcement was, yes, that China on their end was going to lessen some of their export controls on rare earths to the U.S. And then supposedly it sounded like we had given up some of our chip access. And then Howard Lutnick was like, it's
So I
not
have a
that
question.
bad.
Here's my question. I read somewhere that, China is actually even a little bit dubious about, wants to switch out to just use China-made chips and all of their government computers and all that stuff because they're afraid that there's back doors in the chips that are being exported from the U.S. or Taiwan. What if that's actually what's going on?
Well, so here's the thing. That is what China's been saying in response. Now they're like, we're not going to buy these chips. There's going to be back doors for the NSA and the U.S. government. And so it's also going to be like a slap in the face that you're not going to get those profits.
Well, they're getting them through the black market anyway. That's
has been. But
they're like, we'll just keep buying them on the black market. Thanks, but no thanks.
Back in May, in the past when they were talking about the CHIPS Act, part of that was to put a locator in the chips, in case it was ending up in countries it wasn't supposed to be, because to your point, there is that black market. So some are saying that's what China could be pointing to. As far as we know, that hasn't been implemented. So both NVIDIA and AMD are like,
know.
Well,
what are you going to do?
All right, I know exactly what you're thinking. That was a great clip you just watched. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to follow and also check out either these videos or maybe they're on this side. I don't know which side they're on. But we set it up so these are the videos that YouTube is suggesting to you as the best ones that you'll probably like the most. So check them out, this side,